For decades, textbooks claimed the first Americans crossed a frozen inland corridor once glaciers began to retreat. Yet hard California coast evidence, ancient tools, submerged landscapes, and timing that predates the ice-free route proves that this story just doesn't add up. If the earliest migration didn't begin where we always thought, what are we missing about America's true first arrivals? Let's examine what the coast really reveals. By the 1930s, the Clovis culture had captured the imagination of archaeologists. Distinctive fluted spear points, first uncovered near Clovis, New Mexico, were quickly dated to around 13,000 years ago. These artifacts became the textbook benchmark for the earliest human presence in North America. The story that followed seemed logical and tidy. As the last ice age waned, two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide and Cordilleran, began to pull apart, opening a corridor through the heart of the continent. According to this model, humans crossed from Beringia, funneled south through this ice-free passage, and rapidly spread across the land, hunting mammoths and leaving behind the unmistakable signature of Clovis technology. For decades, this narrative was repeated in classrooms, museum exhibits, and scientific papers. The inland corridor became not just a hypothesis, but an article of faith. Yet the foundation of this story was always its timing. The corridor model depended on the idea that a clear path through the glaciers existed just as humans arrived, but geological evidence tells a different story. The interior corridor was locked under ice or choked by meltwater lakes from 26,000 to 14,000 years ago. In other words, for over 10,000 years, the supposed gateway to the Americas was either completely closed or unstable, blocked by walls of ice and impassable terrain. Meanwhile, archaeological discoveries across the Americas began to chip away at the corridor's credibility. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile, confirmed to be at least 14,500 years old, placed people thousands of miles south of the ice sheets before the corridor could have opened. On California's Channel Islands, evidence of human settlement stretches back 12,000 years, with maritime tools and shell middens suggesting a coastal way of life. Farther north, human footprints pressed into the ancient mud of Calvert Island, British Columbia, have been radiocarbon dated to 13,200 years ago. Each new find widened the gap between the corridor's opening and the reality of human presence across the continent. The result is a timeline that simply doesn't fit. The inland corridor remained closed or treacherous when people were already thriving on distant coasts and even deep in South America. The Clovis first narrative, once so dominant, cannot explain how humans reached these far-flung places before the supposed inland route was even available. This growing mismatch between dogma and data forced archaeologists to look beyond the old story and to reconsider how the first Americans truly arrived. 20,000 years ago, the California coast looked nothing like it does today. With the world locked in the grip of the Ice Age, global sea levels dropped by more than 120 meters. This dramatic fall exposed vast swaths of what is now the continental shelf, stretching the shoreline as much as 20 to 30 kilometers farther out to sea. Where waves now crash against cliffs and beaches, there once lay a broad coastal plain, an expanse of grasslands, river valleys, estuaries, and low-lying wetlands. These were not barren wastelands, but vibrant, living corridors teeming with life. The newly revealed shelf formed a natural highway along the Pacific. Freshwater flowed from rivers like the Salinas and the Santa Clara, pooling into wide estuaries that supported flocks of waterfowl and herds of grazing animals. Offshore, dense kelp forests flourished along the edges of the Paleo coast, creating underwater jungles rich with fish, shellfish, sea otters, and seals. For hungry travelers, this was a land of plenty. Shellfish beds lined the tidal flats, seabirds nested in the dunes, and edible plants grew in the damp soils. The coastline itself was a shifting ribbon, sometimes stretching as much as 40 kilometers from today's beaches during the coldest millennia. Modern maps hide most of this story beneath the ocean. As the ice sheets melted and the climate warmed around 15,000 years ago, the sea began to rise. Flood waters raced in, swallowing nearly 2/3 of the ancient coastal plain. Today, about 65% of the Channel Islands' original area lies underwater. The places where early people once camped, fished, and gathered shellfish are now hidden beneath as much as 120 meters of cold Pacific water. Only the highest ridges and ancient headlands remain above the waves, offering faint clues to a world that once existed at the ocean's edge. For those first coastal migrants, the California shoreline was more than a boundary. It was a route of movement and survival. The kelp-rich ecosystems provided reliable food year-round, while sheltered bays and estuaries offered safe harbors for rest and resupply. This lost landscape, now submerged and largely unexplored, was not a dead end. It was a living, resource-rich corridor, perfectly suited for people skilled in coastal foraging and travel. The evidence of their passing may be hidden beneath the waves, but the shape of the ancient coast shows just how plausible and inviting the Pacific route truly was. On the Channel Islands, off California's coast, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that rewrites the story of the first Americans. In layers dating from 12,200 to 11,500 years ago, stone tools and shell middens reveal a way of life built around the sea. Professor Todd Brage's team found stemmed projectile points, crescents, and bifaces on Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands, tools designed for hunting waterfowl, fishing, and gathering shellfish. The faunal remains tell a clear story. These early islanders relied overwhelmingly on marine resources, with some site layers showing over 70% of animal remains from fish, shellfish, and sea mammals. This wasn't a case of people stumbling onto the coast. It was a deliberate, sustained adaptation to a maritime environment. The Channel Islands were never connected to the mainland, even at the lowest sea levels. Crossing the Santa Barbara Channel required watercraft and navigation skills, making accidental arrival unlikely. These early settlers targeted productive kelp forests and estuaries, exploiting a rich food web year-round. Their presence on the islands, separated by up to 12 kilometers of open water, stands as direct evidence of seafaring before the inland ice corridor ever opened. Modern sonar mapping has added another layer to this story. Researchers have identified submerged ridges and terraces off the California coast, former shorelines that date back as far as 15,000 years. As sea levels rose, these ancient campsites and middens slipped beneath the waves, hiding much of the earliest evidence. Yet the patterns that remain above water, site locations, tool types, and diet point to a population that was not only coastal, but deeply maritime. The Channel Islands are a cornerstone, proving California's coast was more than a refuge. It was a gateway for the first Americans. On a remote stretch of Calvert Island in British Columbia, archaeologist Daryl Fedje knelt beside a patch of ancient beach, tracing the outline of a human footprint pressed into compacted sand. Radiocarbon dating of wood fibers embedded in these impressions placed them at 13,200 years old. 29 footprints, left by adults and children, formed a path along the shore, direct physical evidence of people moving through the Pacific Northwest long before the inland corridor was viable. These tracks, preserved by a stroke of geological luck, locked the timeline in place. No inland route stood open at this date. Only the coast could have carried these early travelers south. The story does not end with footprints. Ancient DNA from early American skeletons, including those from the southern tip of Chile to the northern plains, reveals a single founding population with roots in Beringia. Genetic models, assembled by researchers such as Catherine Naslund and others, show these people moved rapidly along the Pacific Rim, dispersing southward as early as 16,000 years ago. The Arlington Springs remains on Santa Rosa Island, dating to nearly 13,000 years ago, confirm that seafaring humans reached the Channel Islands, while the interior remained locked in ice. Although no genome has yet been recovered from Arlington itself, the archaeological context fits perfectly with the broader genetic picture. A coastal migration, not an inland one, explains the distribution and timing of the earliest Americans. With the Calvert footprints and the genetic clock in agreement, the old corridor model stands disproven. The evidence now forms an unbroken chain, stretching from Beringia down the Pacific coast, leaving the inland ice route as a secondary chapter in the story of human arrival. Today, every new find along the California coast reshapes our map of human origins in the Americas. As rising seas threaten to erase more evidence, the search grows urgent. Our understanding of who we are and how we arrived still still depends on what the tides have yet to reveal.